The neural monitors were singing their death song again, a harmonious cascade of electronic warnings that meant someone's brain was about to shut down permanently. David Chen tried to focus on the sound rather than the fact that those particular monitors were attached to his skull, but consciousness kept slipping away like water through his fingers. Medical Station Asclepius 9 wasn't exactly the vacation destination he'd planned when he'd signed up for that cargo run to the border colonies. But then again, getting exposed to an alien plague hadn't been on his itinerary either. Patient exhibits severe synaptic degradation across all neural pathways. Someone was saying in the kind of clinical tone that suggested they were discussing a broken piece of equipment rather than a human being. Standard regenerative protocols have failed. Estimated time to complete neural collapse, 4 hours, 37 minutes. David wanted to make a joke about their precision, trust doctors to give him an exact countdown to brain death, but his vocal cords weren't taking requests anymore. The neural fade plague was living up to its name, systematically shutting down his nervous system one synapse at a time. He'd seen what happened to the other cargo haulers who'd been exposed. First the loss of motor control, then speech, then higher cognitive functions, until finally there was nothing left but a body waiting for its brain to remember how to stop. The medical bay around him hummed with the efficient activity of a facility that dealt with the impossible on a daily basis. Asclepius 9 existed in the neutral zone between human and Korathi space, serving as a quarantine station for victims of diseases that neither species fully understood. The sterile white walls were lined with bioneural monitoring systems that pulsed with soft bioluminescent patterns, creating an oddly peaceful atmosphere for a place where people came to die. "There is another option," a new voice said, and David managed to turn his head enough to see the speaker. She was Korathi, tall and ethereal with the characteristic luminous skin that seemed to glow from within. Her features were elegantly alien: high cheekbones, large eyes that shifted between silver and pale blue, and the graceful bearing that made even the most mundane movements look like dance. The synaptic coupling procedure could repair the damaged pathways, but it would require direct neural contact. "The cultural implications," the human doctor began, "are irrelevant if the patient dies," she interrupted with quiet authority. "I am Zarathus, neural specialist. I volunteer for the procedure." David tried to ask what exactly a synaptic coupling involved, but his voice produced nothing more than a weak croak. Zarathus moved to his bedside with fluid grace, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that seemed to look directly into his fading consciousness. "The procedure will link our neural pathways temporarily," she explained, her voice carrying the musical undertones common to her species. "I will guide the regeneration of your damaged synapses, but you will experience fragments of my thoughts and memories as I will yours. It is intimate." Intimate was one way to put it. David had heard stories about Korathi healing techniques, their ability to literally reach into someone's mind and repair damage that human medicine couldn't even detect. The process required a level of mental connection that their culture reserved for family members and life-bonded partners, which explained the other doctor's concern about cultural implications. "Do it," David managed to whisper, figuring that cultural complications were preferable to being dead. Zarathus nodded and began preparing the bioneural interface, a delicate web of fiber-optic filaments that would create the connection between their nervous systems. The other medical staff stepped back, giving them space while monitoring the procedure from a respectful distance. As she attached the interface to specific points along David's spine and skull, her fingers brushed against his skin, and he felt a strange tingling sensation that had nothing to do with the medical equipment. "Initiating synaptic coupling," she announced, placing her hands on either side of his head. The moment their skin made contact, David's world exploded into sensation and color. The connection was unlike anything he could have imagined. Suddenly he could feel Zarathus's presence in his mind, not just her thoughts, but her emotions, her memories, her very essence flowing through the damaged pathways of his brain like healing light. He experienced flashes of her childhood on the crystal gardens of Korathi Prime, felt her dedication to medicine as a calling that transcended species boundaries, sensed the deep loneliness of someone who had devoted her entire life to healing others at the expense of personal connections. In return, she experienced his memories, growing up on Earth's overcrowded orbital habitats, the freedom he'd found in deep space cargo runs, his tendency to use humor as a shield against the universe's casual cruelty. She felt his fear of dying alone in this sterile medical facility, far from anyone who knew his name, and something in her responded to that loneliness with unexpected warmth. The repair process took hours, during which their consciousness remained partially merged. David could feel Zarathos working with surgical precision to rebuild his neural pathways, her mind guiding the regeneration process with skills that bordered on miraculous. She was literally rewiring his brain, and the intimacy of having someone that deep inside his thoughts was both terrifying and oddly comforting. As the procedure neared completion, David felt his strength returning, his thoughts becoming clearer and more focused. The death song of the neural monitors gradually shifted to healthier rhythms, indicating successful synaptic regeneration. Zarathos was exhausted from the effort, her luminous skin dim with fatigue, but her eyes held a satisfaction that spoke to her calling as a healer. "Well," David said, his voice stronger now as the neural pathways governing speech came back online, "I guess that makes us married now." He meant it as a light-hearted comment about the intimacy they just shared, a way to break the tension and acknowledge what had happened between them without making it awkward. Zarathos froze, her eyes widening with an expression that David couldn't quite interpret. Around them, the bioneural monitoring systems suddenly flared to life, with patterns of bioluminescence that painted the medical bay in shifting colors of blue and silver. "You're mine now," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight and finality that made David's newly repaired nervous system tingle with awareness he didn't fully understand. The oath sensors throughout the medical bay continued their light show, pulsing in rhythms that seemed to celebrate something David was only beginning to realize might be more significant than he'd intended. Whatever he'd just triggered with his casual joke, it was clear that the universe had once again decided to make his life interesting in ways he definitely hadn't signed up for. But as he looked into Zarathos's eyes and felt the lingering warmth of their neural connection, David found himself thinking that maybe, just this once, the universe's sense of humor might have actually worked in his favor. David woke up feeling better than he had in years, which was disconcerting considering he'd been dying of an incurable plague less than 12 hours ago. His neural pathways hummed with an efficiency that felt almost alien, processing sensory input with a clarity that made the medical bay's sterile lighting seem to pulse with hidden patterns. Even more strange was the way the station's computer systems seemed to recognize him. Access panels that should have been restricted were now responding to his biometric signatures, and he found himself able to navigate through data networks that definitely weren't meant for patients. The synaptic coupling was more successful than anticipated, Zarathos said, entering his recovery room with the graceful efficiency that seemed to characterize everything she did. She looked tired but alert, her luminous skin showing signs of the exhaustion that came from performing neural surgery for several hours straight. "Your brain activity is actually superior to baseline human parameters. The regenerated pathways are functioning at optimal efficiency." "Great, so I'm not dying anymore. That's definitely an improvement." David sat up carefully, testing his motor control and finding everything working perfectly. "Though I have to ask, why can I suddenly access half the station's computer systems? Did the procedure come with administrative privileges?" Zarathos shifted uncomfortably, her eyes taking on that same unreadable expression he'd seen when he'd made his joke about being married. "That is complicated. Your casual remark yesterday, combined with the physical contact during the healing process, has triggered certain legal protocols under Korathi law." "Legal protocols?" "The consort claim ritual. When you said, 'I guess that makes us married,' while we were in neural contact and physical communion, you initiated a formal bonding declaration. Under my people's law, Such declarations are considered legally binding regardless of cultural context or intent. David stared at her, trying to process what she was saying, while his newly enhanced brain helpfully provided him with access to the station's legal database. The information that flowed through his consciousness was comprehensive and slightly terrifying. Korathi consort bonds were indeed legally recognized throughout the sector, granted significant legal and social privileges, and were considered permanent unless formally dissolved by mutual consent. So when I joked about being married, I actually got married. In the eyes of Korathi law, yes. The bond grants shared access to each other's legal standing, medical authority, and security clearances. Which is why you can now access my research file and medical credentials. David experimented with his new access, pulling up Zarathus's research history and finding himself looking at decades of neuroscience work that would have impressed the most advanced human medical institutions. But buried in the recent files was something that made his enhanced pattern recognition abilities start connecting dots in very disturbing ways. These outbreak reports, he said, highlighting suspicious data patterns in the neural fade case files. The infection vectors don't match natural plague progression. The initial cases all trace back to specific refugee camps, and the timing correlates with. He paused, his enhanced cognitive abilities processing the shipping manifests and communication logs that his new access privileges had unlocked. Corporate biotech supply deliveries. Zarathus moved to his side, and he could feel a strange resonance between them. Not quite the full neural connection they'd shared during the procedure, but something deeper than normal human interaction. She was studying the same data, her medical expertise combining with his pattern recognition to reveal the scope of what they were looking at. This is not a natural outbreak, she said quietly. Someone deliberately introduced neural fade into the refugee populations. The genetic markers are too specific, the progression too controlled. This is a field test. Field test for what? Experimental neural modification techniques. Look at the treatment protocols being used in the corporate-sponsored facilities. She pulled up additional files, her access credentials now enhanced by their bond to show classification levels that neither of them should have been able to reach alone. They're not trying to cure the plague. They're studying how it affects different neural architectures, testing treatments that could potentially be weaponized. The full horror of the situation became clear as they pieced together the evidence. Human biotech corporations, working with corrupt officials in both governments, had deliberately infected refugee populations with an engineered plague to test experimental neural modification technologies. The refugees were being used as unwilling test subjects, their suffering and death serving as data points for weapons research that could potentially affect entire populations. "We have to report this," David said, but even as he spoke, he could see the problem. The evidence was classified at levels that required both their access credentials to unlock, and the biolocks were specifically designed to prevent unauthorized distribution. But how do we prove it without violating about 17 different security protocols? "The consort bond," Zarathus said slowly. "If we ratify the bond formally, it would grant us joint authority over any medical research involving both species. We could legally declassify and distribute this information under interspecies medical emergency protocols. And if we don't ratify it, the bond dissolves automatically at dawn. Our access privileges revert to normal levels, and this evidence becomes inaccessible again." David was beginning to understand why she looked so conflicted. Ratifying their accidental bond would give them the authority to expose the conspiracy, but it would also make their connection permanent in ways that neither of them had chosen. On the other hand, letting the bond dissolve would mean allowing the conspiracy to continue, condemning countless refugees to death for the sake of weapons research. "There's another problem," Zarathus added, checking the station's security feeds. "Corporate security vessels are requesting docking clearance. They're claiming routine inspection authority, but the timing is suspicious." David's enhanced pattern recognition was already analyzing the security data. cross-referencing ship registrations with corporate affiliates and finding connections that painted a very clear picture. They're not here for inspection. They're here to suppress evidence. Someone knows we've accessed classified files. As if summoned by their conversation, the medical bay's communication system activated with an incoming priority message. Director Kane of Biotech Consolidated appeared on the screen, his expression carrying the kind of professional concern that didn't quite hide the threat underneath. "Medical staff," Kane announced, "we've detected unauthorized access to classified research files. This represents a serious security breach that requires immediate investigation. All personnel with access to sensitive data are to report for debriefing within the hour." "Debriefing," David said after the transmission ended. "That's a polite way of saying memory modification and permanent silence." The dawn deadline isn't arbitrary, Zarathus realized. They need to resolve this before our bond becomes permanent and legally protected. Once ratified, a Korathi consort bond grants diplomatic immunity that would make it much harder for them to simply make us disappear. David looked at the evidence they'd uncovered, then at Zarathus, feeling the strange resonance between them that spoke to possibilities he'd never imagined. The choice wasn't just about exposing a conspiracy. It was about choosing between safety and justice, between individual freedom and shared responsibility. "How long do we have?" he asked. 6 hours until dawn. 6 hours to decide whether to make this bond permanent or let it dissolve, and hope we can find another way to stop them. And in the meantime, we try to stay alive long enough to make that choice. The station's lights dimmed as corporate security began implementing what they called enhanced quarantine protocols. And David realized that the universe's sense of humor had once again placed him in an impossible situation. The only question now was whether his accidental marriage to an alien healer would save thousands of lives, or just get them both killed in fascinating new ways. The corporate security team moved through Medical Station Asclepius 9 with the kind of methodical efficiency that suggested they'd done this before. David watched them on the security feeds as they systematically sealed sections of the station, ostensibly implementing enhanced quarantine protocols, but actually cutting off escape routes and isolating potential witnesses. Director Kane had arrived with a small army of specialists whose equipment looked more suited to evidence destruction than medical assistance. "They're being very thorough," Zarathus observed, her voice tight with controlled worry as they monitored the corporate forces from the relative safety of the Central Medical Corps. The bioneural computers surrounding them pulsed with soft bioluminescence, creating an oddly peaceful atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the methodical invasion happening throughout the rest of the station. "Too thorough," David agreed, his enhanced pattern recognition parsing the movements on screen. "Look at their search pattern. They're not looking for infected patients or contaminated areas. They're hunting for specific data access points. They know exactly what we found, which means someone's been monitoring our research." The bond between them had continued to evolve since the previous day, creating a connection that was both exhilarating and terrifying. David could sense Zarathus's emotions, her dedication to protecting the refugees, her fear of the permanent commitment they were facing, and underneath it all, a growing warmth that suggested their accidental relationship might be becoming something more than just legal necessity. "There's something else," she said, pulling up a new set of files that their combined access had unlocked. "The neural fade plague isn't just being tested on refugees. Look at these distribution projections. They're planning to release modified versions in Korathi space, targeting our neural specialists specifically." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the medical bay's temperature control. The files showed detailed plans for biological warfare that would specifically target the Korathi's most valuable citizens, their healers and neuroscientists. The goal wasn't just weapons testing, it was systematic genocide disguised as medical research. They want to eliminate Korathi healing abilities entirely, he realized. Without your neural specialists, any future conflicts would favor human medical technology. They're trying to create a permanent advantage by destroying your people's greatest strength. Which explains why they're so determined to stop us, Zarathus said. This evidence doesn't just expose war crimes, it reveals plans for species-level genocide. The Central Medical Corps was supposed to be secure, but David's enhanced awareness picked up the subtle changes in air pressure and electromagnetic fields that indicated someone was cutting through the sealed doors. Corporate security had apparently decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. "We're about to have company," he warned, looking around for defensive options. The medical corps was designed for patient care, not combat, but his newly expanded understanding of bioneural systems suggested some creative possibilities. "The bioneural computers," Zarathus said, apparently thinking along the same lines. "They're designed to interface with Korathi neural patterns, but if we modified the feedback loops, we could turn them into the galaxy's most sophisticated stun weapons," David finished. "I like the way you think. How long do you need?" 3 minutes to reconfigure the neural interface protocols. Can you buy us that much time?" David was already moving toward the medical corps' communication system, an idea forming that was either brilliant or completely insane. Ever wonder what happens when you broadcast Korathi healing frequencies through a station-wide intercom system? The security door finally gave way just as David activated his improvised defense system. The first wave of corporate security troops stumbled into the medical corps, expecting to find 2 civilians hiding among the medical equipment. Instead, they found themselves subjected to neural frequencies that were specifically designed to promote healing and mental clarity in Korathi physiology, but which had distinctly different effects on human brains not adapted to such stimulation. The result was a squad of highly trained soldiers suddenly experiencing what could best be described as involuntary enlightenment. They stood in the doorway, weapons lowered, staring at the pulsing bioneural displays with expressions of profound wonder and confusion. "Fascinating," one of them said dreamily. "I can see the mathematical beauty underlying all existence. Why were we fighting again?" "Focus on the mission," their squad leader tried to order, but his voice lacked conviction as the healing frequencies continued to wash over them. "We need to, what were we doing?" "I believe you were planning to commit war crimes," Zarathus said helpfully, having finished her modifications to the bioneural computers. "But perhaps this is a good time to reconsider your life choices." David had to admit that weaponized enlightenment was probably the most uniquely Korathi approach to self-defense he could have imagined. The corporate security team was effectively neutralized, though they seemed to be enjoying the experience far more than typical combat casualties. "This is only temporary," Zarathus warned. "The effects will wear off in about 20 minutes, and Director Kane will undoubtedly send more teams with neural shielding. Then we need to move fast. Can we broadcast the evidence from here?" "Yes, but only if we have the authorization codes that come with a ratified consort bond. The biolocs require joint species authority for this level of classified material." David looked at the evidence they'd gathered, then at Zarathus, feeling the strange resonance between them that had grown stronger throughout their crisis. The bond wasn't just about legal convenience anymore. Somewhere between sharing neural pathways and fighting corporate conspiracies, they discovered a partnership that worked on levels neither of them had expected. "There's something I should tell you," she said quietly, apparently sensing his thoughts through their connection. "The consort bond isn't just a legal contract. It creates a permanent neural link that deepens over time. Bonded pairs share thoughts, emotions, even physical sensations. We would literally become part of each other's lives in ways that transcend individual identity. And you've never formed such a bond before." "Never. I dedicated my life entirely to medicine, believing that personal connections would compromise my effectiveness as a healer. But this bond, it doesn't make me weaker, it makes us both stronger." Director Kane's voice echoed through the station's communication system, announcing that they had 30 minutes to surrender peacefully or face enhanced containment protocols. David suspected that enhanced containment was corporate speak for making them disappear permanently. Decision time, he said, watching the bioneural computers pulse around them like a constellation of living stars. Do we ratify this bond and expose the conspiracy? Or do we try to find another way that doesn't involve accidentally getting married to save the galaxy? When you put it like that, Zarathus said with a smile that made the bioluminescent patterns around them seem to brighten, it sounds almost romantic. Almost. The part where we might die horribly, if this doesn't work, somewhat diminishes the romantic atmosphere. David laughed, feeling the bond between them resonate with shared humor and determination. You know what? I can think of worse ways to spend my last few hours than being married to someone who can literally fix brains and turn medical equipment into Enlightenment weapons. Is that a yes? That's a yes. Let's get married and save the galaxy. Though I reserve the right to complain if the honeymoon involves more corporate death squads. As they moved toward the bioneural interface that would formalize their bond, David reflected that his mother had always said he'd know when he met the right person. He just hadn't expected that recognition to come while hiding from corporate assassins in an alien medical facility, or that the right person would be someone who could literally reach into his mind and rearrange his thoughts. But then again, he'd never been one to do things the conventional way. The formal ratification ceremony began as corporate security forces moved through the station with military precision, their enhanced neural shielding making them immune to David's improvised Enlightenment weapons. Director Kane had apparently learned from his predecessor's mistakes and brought equipment specifically designed to counter Korathi bioneural technologies. David and Zarathus had perhaps 20 minutes before the corporate forces breached the medical corps' final defenses. The bioneural computers surrounding them shifted into ceremonial mode, their bioluminescent displays creating intricate patterns that told the story of two consciousness choosing to merge across species boundaries. The ritual itself was beautiful, swirling lights that responded to their heartbeats, harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate in their bones, and a growing sense of connection that transcended anything David had previously experienced. Place your hands here, Zarathus guided him to the central interface, where bioneural filaments would create the permanent link between their nervous systems. Once we complete this, there's no going back. The bond will continue to deepen throughout our lives, sharing not just thoughts and emotions, but also skills, memories, and perspectives. Any other side effects I should know about? David asked, trying to maintain his usual humor despite the gravity of the situation. Korathi live approximately 3 times longer than humans. The bond will extend your natural lifespan to match mine, assuming we survive the next few hours. Well, that's a bonus I hadn't expected. Extended warranty on my neural pathways. As they placed their hands on the interface, David felt the connection between them suddenly intensify. The partial bond they'd shared since his healing became something deeper and more comprehensive. He could sense Zarathus's thoughts as clearly as his own, feel her emotions as if they were his feelings, and access her vast medical knowledge as if he'd spent decades studying Korathi neuroscience. In return, she experienced his memories and perspectives, his adaptability, his irreverent humor that helped cope with impossible situations, and his fundamental optimism that somehow, despite all evidence to the contrary, things would work out if you were clever enough and stubborn enough to make them work. Authorization codes confirmed, the bioneural computers announced in harmonious unison. Consort bond ratified, joint species medical authority activated. David immediately accessed the classified files they discovered, but now his understanding went far beyond pattern recognition. Through Zarathus's medical expertise flowing directly into his consciousness, he could see the full scope of the bioweapons program, not just the current neural fade testing, but plans for dozens of species-specific plagues designed to target the unique physiologies of every major spacefaring race in the sector. They're not just planning genocide, he said, his voice tight with horror as the implications became clear. They're planning to become the only surviving spacefaring species, complete human dominance through biological warfare. The evidence upload began automatically, their combined authorization overriding every security protocol on the station. Terabytes of classified data streamed out to every major news network, medical authority, and government database in human and Korathi space. The bioneural computers coordinated the transmission with beautiful efficiency, ensuring that the evidence would be impossible to suppress or deny. Corporate security finally breached the medical corps' defenses just as the upload reached critical mass. Director Kane entered with a squad of heavily armed troops, their weapons trained on David and Zarathus, as the evidence of his crimes broadcast across the galaxy in real time. "You have no idea what you've done," Kane snarled, his professional composure finally cracking. "The balance of power in this sector was based on lies, genocide, and war crimes," Zarathus interrupted, her voice carrying new authority from their bond. That balance needed to be destroyed. David felt her strength flowing through their connection, just as she drew on his practical problem-solving abilities. Together, they were more than either could have been alone. Her medical precision combined with his adaptability, her deep knowledge merged with his intuitive understanding of how to make impossible things work. "The transmission is complete," the bioneural computers announced. "Evidence has been received and verified by 17 major news networks, 43 medical authorities, and both the Human Colonial Council and the Korathi Defense Corps." Kane's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized that his career, his conspiracy, and probably his freedom had just been broadcast to billions of viewers across the galaxy. "You've destroyed decades of strategic planning. Do you have any idea how many people will die because of your interference?" "Fewer than would have died from your bioweapons program," David replied, feeling his enhanced pattern recognition abilities calculating the probable casualties from the planned genocides. "Though I suspect the main casualties will be corporate executives facing war crimes tribunals." The sound of additional ships docking echoed through the station's hull, but these weren't more corporate security vessels. David's expanded access to the station's systems showed him Korathi Defense Corps vessels alongside human colonial navy ships, arriving in response to the emergency broadcasts triggered by their evidence upload. "Director Kane," a new voice announced over the communication system, "this is Admiral Torres of the Colonial Navy. You and your personnel are under arrest for war crimes, conspiracy to commit genocide, and violations of approximately 200 interspecies treaties. Surrender immediately or face military action." Kane's response was to order his troops to open fire, apparently deciding that if he was going down, he might as well take the evidence with him. But the bioneural computers had other ideas. Responding to the threat against their newly bonded pair, the medical systems activated every defensive protocol in their considerable arsenal. The result was something that would probably be studied by military tacticians for decades: a medical facility temporarily transformed into the most sophisticated non-lethal weapons platform in the galaxy. Healing frequencies became sonic weapons, bioneural interfaces projected electromagnetic pulses, and the life support systems began generating atmospheric compositions that made it very difficult for anyone not linked to the medical computers to remain conscious. "I love your people's approach to self-defense," David told Zarathus as corporate security troops found themselves experiencing involuntary sedation courtesy of medical-grade atmospheric modification. "We prefer to heal rather than harm," she replied, "but we're very good at making aggressive people take naps." The boarding parties from the Defense Corps and Colonial Navy found the medical corps filled with unconscious corporate security troops and two individuals calmly monitoring the evidence transmission that was reshaping interspecies politics in real time. Director Kane had been efficiently sedated by medical systems that diagnosed his aggressive behavior as a treatable psychological disorder. 6 months later, David stood in the observation deck of the joint research vessel Harmony, watching a refugee convoy finally receiving proper medical treatment instead of being used as test subjects. The trials had concluded with unprecedented cooperation between human and Korathi authorities, leading to the complete dismantling of the bioweapons program and the establishment of new oversight protocols for interspecies medical research. How are you adapting to the extended lifespan projections? Zarathus asked, joining him at the observation window. Their bond had stabilized into something uniquely beautiful, a connection that enhanced both their individual strengths while creating new capabilities neither had possessed alone. Well, considering I now have about 200 years to figure out what I want to do with my life, I'm thinking of taking up some hobbies. Maybe learning to play that Centauri instrument that sounds like a dying cat having an existential crisis. The Vorthak. That's actually considered quite beautiful by Centauri standards, which explains a lot about Centauri standards. Their shared laughter rippled through the bond, a moment of pure joy that had nothing to do with saving the galaxy, and everything to do with choosing to face an uncertain future together. David had gained more than just extended life and alien medical knowledge. He discovered that the universe's tendency to complicate his existence had finally worked in his favor, giving him a partner whose strength complemented his own in ways that made them both more than they had been alone. The Andromedan colony is reporting another outbreak, Zarathus mentioned, checking the communications feed. Unknown pathogen, immune to standard treatments. Sounds like a job for the galaxy's most accidental